Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Good evening and welcome to our first Women of Nobles kickoff event. We are incredibly excited to start this initiative with our graduates who identify as female, and we are thrilled that so many of you are able to join us tonight. As some of you know, in about 3.5 years, we will be celebrating 50 years since Nobles went co-ed in 1975. So we thought it was time for us to officially gather this group of graduates together. Women of Nobles is intended to provide graduates who identify as female with events and opportunities for social and professional networking within the Nobles community. We hope that Women of Nobles will connect, create new relationships, and increase bonds across generations of Nobles graduates. We hope that these yearly events, which will typically happen in March, Women's History Month, will share stories of women from various industries and give you all a chance to make connections within the Nobles community, hopefully sometime soon in person. But in the meantime, we have formed a group on our graduate directory and networking platform. You can find that at noblesgraduates.com, and we hope that everyone who hasn't yet will all join. We'll put that into the chat in a minute. For our first event, we thought it was fitting that we invite our head of school, Dr. Cathy Hall, to share her own story, her path as an educator that led her to Nobles. First, I'll introduce Cathy, and then we will hear from her. Following that, we'll have a question and answer session. So if you do have any questions during her chat, feel free to pop it into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and then she and I will talk through those afterwards. And the session will also be recorded if you know anyone who wasn't able to attend. Cathy Hall brings tremendous expertise to her role as the first female head at Nobles. As of next fall, she will be one of only 3 female heads in the ISL, along with BB&N and St. George's. Nationally, female heads of school make up a little less than a third of leadership within independent schools. And while Cathy is often asked to share about the work she is doing currently at Nobles, tonight we are asking her to share about her career trajectory. How did she get here? Over the course of her career in education, Cathy has been an upper school English teacher, a middle school math teacher, and a varsity soccer coach. Before coming to Nobles in 2017, Cathy was the director of technology, then the academic dean, and most recently, the assistant head of school at the Episcopal Academy in Newtown, Pennsylvania. Cathy has a strong record of innovating while securing traditions and a sense of community. Cathy received her bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton University in 1997, where she also played varsity soccer. She earned a master's degree in the social foundations in education in 2001 and her doctorate in education in 2007, both from the University of Virginia. She was the technology director at the Langley School in Virginia before moving into a technology leadership role for the Arlington, Virginia public school system. For more than a decade, she also served as a consultant and conference leader for independent schools across the country in the areas of diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. Cathy has frequently published on issues of independent school education and has presented at numerous national conferences about various topics, most recently about student wellness and rigor. For anyone who knows Cathy or has heard her speak, her values and vision for education are clear. She is innovative, collaborative, decisive, calm, and compassionate. She matches rigorous, disciplined analysis with an open mind, keen institution for people, and a strong sense of community. Cathy is also a caring person who has strength of character and solid judgment, and I personally feel lucky to work for her every day. She lives right here on the Nobles campus with her 3 children, Matthew, Thomas, and Evelyn, and her dog, Jack. Cathy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much. I really can't tell you how excited I am to just have this event happening. And this is something that it is amazing we haven't had before. We just needed Kate to come in and get this off the ground, and to know that we've had graduates since 75, and to see the list of names and the decades it spans is really inspiring. So I'm honored to be the kickoff speaker for tonight, but really hope we can have some great conversation as well. And as I thought about it, I started thinking for a while, of course, leading up to tonight, what I wanted to share. And I do hope there's lots of time for questions and answers. So I promise I won't speak too long at you. These webinars, I've gotten used to seeing my own face in front of me a little too much. So would love to have some conversation. as I thought about what I wanted to share, I kept circling back to some of those core lessons that I feel I've learned. I am a pretty big junkie for growth mindset and tend to focus on how I've changed and what I've learned along the way. And there are some core lessons that some of which have been really challenging and have opened different doors or opened my eyes to things about myself. There have been lessons that have been really humbling, at times demoralizing right in the moment, but they've also strengthened my sense of self. They're lessons who have taught me who I want to be and don't want to be as a leader, as a person, as a mother, and how I live my life. So I thought I would highlight some of those lessons learned. They'll tell a little bit about my life journey, how I've learned to understand it so far. But I'll be honest, I certainly hope this list I share tonight will be different in a decade. I know it certainly was a decade ago. So please see this as a work in progress list. First, I'll say I finally have learned that being different is actually pretty cool. And I think it's a lot cooler to say now than when I was growing up. I grew up outside of the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia, and I grew up in the 1970s and 80s. It was very much not cool to be sort of how I was, and what kind of stood out for me as a young person. I was an athlete from the outset. Being active, I should be more specific, being active was very much where I thrived. I certainly was very bright in school, was lucky that I could pull that off because I was as disorganized, despite how maybe now I am the opposite extreme of a little bit too type A. If you had met me when I was 8, you would not have envisioned I would be running the Noble and Greeno School. And I really did struggle with just sort of this basics of sitting still in a chair, and I was chatty, and I, like now, talk too fast, talk too much. And I love to be active and play all the things that all the boys in my class did. And honestly, where I grew up and at the time I grew up was extraordinarily not gendered normal. And I found myself playing with only boys at recess because they are the ones that were out there playing football and soccer, and every single girl in where I went and starched dresses and playing house, and none of that was anywhere near where I wanted to be. I grew up when there wasn't a Gap Kids, and so not wearing the dresses meant I was wearing boys' sweatpants that often didn't fit right and had holes in the knees, and that certainly was not cool. And I found school as a young person to be pretty difficult. I often felt different in ways that was really isolating. I certainly had friends, and because I could kind of pull off being a pretty good athlete and being pretty smart in school, I certainly was able to keep my head up. But it was hard. It was very hard to feel you stuck out in ways that weren't celebrated. I was put in the hallway a lot in first grade for not raising my hands enough. There were things that certainly didn't lead me to feel inspired and invested in. And that's a tough piece socially, and you have a sense of identity that somehow isn't being recognized and lifted up, but actually is being judged. And it took some really tough choices on my part. I didn't know enough at the time to know what I cared about. So I stuck with that. And to be an athlete back then, I had to play on all boys teams and did that almost all the way through middle school. The first co-ed or even all girls teams I played on would have been through in middle school. And even then I was on the boys middle school soccer team or wherever I needed to be. And, for me, the first place I found athletically where I could thrive was in high school. And at the time, only public schools in the DC area, at least, had thriving athletic programs. And I started to have my head up a little bit more and started to have a sense of self that was celebrated. And that was much later for me and much longer for me, where I really had that sense of looking back. I'm proud of how cool I think I was when I was 8 and 12 and 14. I have a daughter now, and she's 9, and she inspires me on a daily basis, and for many reasons. But one is just her boldness and her confidence in being who she is. And she's different in ways that I just am envious of, and her finding her voice and blazing her path. And I certainly didn't feel that way at 9. And I think part of it certainly is the change in our generations. And I think part of it's just how this wonderful girl is wired. A couple of weeks ago, she'd been begging me to cut her hair super short. She's got this gorgeous curly hair that I envy every day. And I didn't realize, what am I doing giving her a hard time about this? And I actually cut my own kid's hair, which I can speak to later if you'd like to ask. But in the moment, so we ended up cutting her hair really short, and it looks awesome. And I asked her a question, something along the lines of, you'd all worried about anyone trying to equip her for going into school the next day. And what if anyone says anything mean to my daughter? She's looked at me without flinching and said, Mom, if they're my friends, they'll support me. Why wouldn't they? I was like, right, why wouldn't they? And just how much it shifted in that. The second lesson I'd like to point to is I learned that I can be a female leader whose leadership is not just defined by my gender. And I can also use my privileged role as one of the very few female leaders in this chair to make a difference for others. And that's something that's taken me a little while to get to. I've been struck by all the ways in which we ascribe gender when speaking about women, but not men's things. I think about the Women's World Cup. When it's the Men's World Cup, it just says World Cup. When it's the Women's World Cup, all of the language has to specify that that's what it is. These notions of normalizing and how we center around that. So when I stepped into this role in particular, and it certainly has happened prior in my career, not just coming to Nobles and being the head of school, I was interviewed by the nobleman moments after the hiring decision was made. So I was still in Philadelphia. And the very first question was, how does it feel to be the first female leader? And I had that reaction of why name it the Women's World Cup and not just World Cup, and bristled internally a little bit. Like, how does it feel to be Noble's leader, not just the female leader? And yet, being the first female leader at Nobles is significant. It does mean something to me and to the school, and it should make a difference. And so finding the ways to weave those two things together, of not wanting to be defined wholly by being a female leader in the school or in general nationally, and yet wanting to not lose the importance of that and not wanting to miss the responsibility and the opportunity to use the position that I've been able to attain to actually make a difference for others. Kate mentioned some of the statistics around the ISL and having only 3 out of 16 schools who will be led by women next year. And by the way, it's only 1 person of color out of the 16 as well. The athletic director statistics aren't much different. And the statistics on women leading nationally are extremely skewed. I see these reports regularly, and they suggest there has been progress. But when you look at schools that are co-ed, that tend to be thriving financially, you can look at a certain budget size and up. Certainly in areas around New England, really schools like Nobles, the numbers actually have not changed that much. The statistics are actually pretty jarring. There are very few women who are leading schools like Nobles nationally. Yes, there are more women leading other kinds of, and at middle level of administration in schools, there's been some great progress made. But I at times think that we're actually kind of hiding behind some of those statistics to not admit some of the ways in which we have not made the movements. And of course, that's not limited to education. I actually argue that institutions, the equivalent of which are our Nobles out of other sectors, we're seeing the same trend line, whether it's in the finance sector or other spaces where, yes, women have had lots of progress, but they're still not sitting at that table. Boardrooms are still very consistently closed off at certain tiers of our sectors around the country. I know that I stand on the shoulders of the trailblazers before me, of the Ruth Bader Ginsburgs, people who recently we know lives have passed, where we recognize, my goodness, the impact they've made on my ability to be standing here now. And how do I pay that forward? I do believe in part it's sitting in this chair and just leading well, just being a strong leader while also being female, not because I am and not having it define me, but by doing it and being here and modeling that, I'm setting out an example for young men and women to just see a new image of leadership, to hear a new voice, to feel a new normal. Recalibrating that normal is something that I believe I can play a role in if I do my job well and lead with the integrity and the principles that I hope to do in my tenure here at Nobles for over what I hope is many years. I also need to know the moments when I need to speak up. And I'll be honest, this is really hard, right? Finding those moments where you absolutely know you need to be the upstander in the moment. It's hard for all of us. We all think we would do it all right and well, and then you're faced with those moments. Well, I don't want my leadership defined by my gender. I feel very strongly I need to use my privileged place to make a difference, to interrupt bias, to help address the systemic issues that continue to discriminate against and at times put down women. I'm able to do that uniquely in ways others who are not in power can't. And so what does that look like in a way that builds up and does not tear down? It doesn't look like me going off on tears and making that all my one agenda item where folks assume that's the one thing I'll say every time, but it does mean I'm not quiet in a moment where I know I need to have a voice and where I know my silence is either complicit or is allowing those who are disempowered to stay disempowered. My third lesson is I've learned that the best decisions actually were not the ones I made for myself. When I look back on my life and the most impactful pivots, I'd like to give myself credit and say I lined all of this up and got all of it done right and well. And of course, I'm sure all of you on this call would say the same, that actually many of the things that just fell into your lap or were forced upon you, you can see the blessing in them many years later. So the first one for me, Kate mentioned that I played soccer in college, and I was a pretty competitive 3-sport athlete through high school. So actually going down to one sport, it may sound strange, but that was actually a big adjustment for me. I just loved being out there. I actually picked soccer as the sport to play in college because I loved the smell of grass. And at the time, soccer was still on grass and field hockey was on turf. And anyways, I really was a junkie for just being out there. And I had never in my entire career, despite year-round 3 sports, had I had one injury. I'd never missed a practice. And I was a pretty aggressive player. You could probably guess that about me. And then one day, my spring of my freshman year, I had one injury of my whole career, and it was the end of my career. I had a knee injury that honestly today probably wouldn't have ended my career. Back then, gosh, this was now 30 years ago, it was more of an art than a science in fixing pretty bad knee injuries. And the surgery actually made it worse and worse and worse. And at the time, I did think I would get back. And it took me a little while to realize that this is actually it. That last practice was it. And at the time, it did feel like the ceiling fell. It had been my identity. That was where, if you look through my high school yearbook, that was how I was sort of defined. I certainly had a lot of social networks, but a lot of it was rooted in that identity of being a student athlete. And I realized in that moment that actually I had not been tending to what my real identity was. I had been kind of, yes, enjoying what I was doing, but really ignoring other aspects of what I cared about. Obviously loved school. I was so fortunate to be at a great school and certainly was intellectually curious, but just hadn't spent the time soul searching on where I wanted to go, what I wanted to be. So I made one of my better decisions in life in that moment. I at least had the wherewithal to say, things aren't going well, and I feel like I need a pivot. And I saw one of those flyers on a lamppost at Princeton for a study abroad program. And they did not have a very big program back then. It was very small. And I stumbled into this program through London School of Economics, where I took some courses and I got to work in Parliament. I got assigned to work with somebody in the House of Lords. He happened to be on the Council of Europe. I was traveling with him. I mean, it's crazy the experiences I had in the semester, but also just the unbelievable shift in my headspace and a sudden focus that had nothing to do with my prior kind of identity as I looked at it, and one that let me just regroup. I came back to campus that next year with just a completely different mindset, and one where I actually realized I needed to take some time. I was an economics major, which I absolutely loved, but I had no clue what I wanted to do. I had assumed I'd go to law school or business school, and yet I really hadn't thought about it that much beyond I'll just kind of do that. And my father, who all my life had talked about always just have the passion, whatever it is, but just have one. And I had that kind of rudderless feeling. And so I made my next big pivot that I'm so glad that I did and was willing to do. And that I decided to take a year off between my junior and senior year. At Princeton, you do a senior thesis, which is a really intensive process. And I knew I didn't even know what I wanted to write about. And I knew I wanted to go into that having a sense of my next step. And so I took the year off, but actually in the first few weeks, I was running a soccer camp for 4-year-olds at the schools, a nursery through 8th grade school that I'd gone to as a child myself, a little cooperative school outside of DC and Virginia. And I was in the process of lining up all of these internships and opportunities to kind of find my life. And while I was down there on the field, the head of school, who had actually taught my sister kindergarten, walked down and said, we need a computer teacher this fall, to which I said, I don't own a computer. Granted, this is a very long time ago, and I really didn't. She's like, you're smart, you'll figure it out. And she offered me $16,000 a year to take on this role of being a jack of all trades, teach computer classes, coach 16 things, fill in for people in classrooms. And I can remember saying to my mother, can you believe they're going to pay me $16,000 to do this? It had never occurred to me that this could be a line of work. And it really was, as cheesy as it sounds, a moment of absolute clarity. And I never looked back. And I spent the year there working. I actually managed to do my senior year commuting, if you can believe it. I ended up doing a senior thesis. I got someone in the economics department who is phenomenal and ended up being willing to do, I did a class size analysis and set up a study at that school and was able to keep my foothold in there. And then I stayed on there full time. That school took leaps of faith on me and ended up becoming I was in my early 20s, I think, when they hired me as director of technology. And again, remember, I hadn't owned a computer a few years before. And so just finding those opportunities where it falls in your lap and you've got to realize this is something I wasn't looking for has certainly been a gut check for me. And when I'm presented with something that just feels totally off, it's at least taught me to go, do I really know what I'm talking about? Is it possible this is a good thing for me? Fourth, I've learned that mentors make all of the difference in the world, in your career and in your life journey, and finding the right ones. But I would also say letting the right ones find you is everything. There's so much research around the fact that women are so much less likely to seek out mentors than men, and the role that then plays in everything from pay gaps to access to leadership. I think this is actually one of our bigger challenges when I think about women being in positions of senior leadership. Mentorship is something to me that's absolutely central to it, and figuring out structures to that mentorship. I lucked into a lot of my mentors. The first ones with no question were coaches. And many of those coaches who believed in me, and again, while I'm out there trying to scrap it out with all boys on a field, just had faith and would counsel and give feedback. For me, it's finding mentors and now looking to serve as a mentor. You want to find a mentor who knows where you want to go, who can honestly give you feedback. I think people often seek mentorship, but they don't really want to use the mentor the right way. They see the mentor as just, hey, can you give me a job when I need it? You need mentors who get to know you and get to are comfortable being honest, where you're comfortable being vulnerable, where you can actually hear what's being said, where you have shared goals, and people who want to take a risk on you. And what I have found in my life is you want to find people who want to be a mentor. There are so many of them out there. They're craving the chance to pay it forward. And I wouldn't limit that to just women. I think there are women mentors who have transformed my life. There are male mentors who have transformed my life, many who are seeking to make a difference for women in the workforce, and vice versa. I certainly, when I think about where I feel a responsibility, serving as a mentor to others is very, very high on the list. And I say yes wherever I can. I was proud to be a part of a Penn University of Pennsylvania leadership program, a master's program for many years when I was in Philadelphia. I answer the phone whenever I get a call, whether I know the person or not. And I know many other of my colleagues do the same. It feels like one of the more impactful ways I can make a difference. And that's something I've really tripled down on here at Nobles, and in trying to open up pathways for leadership for our aspiring young women, and in being very proactive in that. And trying to consistently say, if you want to have a conversation anytime, and for many of them, setting up programs for that. And I think we still have lots of room to grow, but that is something that I feel very passionately about. Fifth, I'd say that I've learned that saying yes to things, just saying yes without expectation, even if you don't feel qualified, that can be the best decision you can make. And I know so often people are wary to say yes if they're like, I don't know what I'm going to get paid for that extra duty, and I don't know if I really have the skill set. And I was hired for jobs I was completely unqualified for, and yet they became transformative. I was willing to say yes to them. In addition to being hired for the tech director job at Langley back in the mid 90s when I didn't own a computer, probably the next leap of faith was when I moved to Philadelphia and I was finishing my doctorate, hadn't finished it yet. I was actually looking to get out of technology. I was looking at much more school leadership and wanting to be most of my doctoral work. And I saw myself as a teacher, not a technology person. I love the aspects of leadership embedded in technology and transformation for teaching and learning. But I've always been a teacher at heart. And so I was moving to Philly and looking at some school leadership roles. And this opportunity at Episcopal Academy came up. And what was so fascinating about the school is they were moving campuses. So Episcopal is now about 240 years old. Close to it. It was founded in 1785, founded in downtown Philly, and over time had developed two campuses. So there are about 1,250 students there. And at the time, they had two separate campuses, which is really problematic for just school culture and logistics. And the campuses are very cramped. And the school had made this bold move, really bold move, almost overnight. Some land opened up a little bit west of where they were in Newtown Square, and the board decided to buy it. And it really wasn't overnight. I think we're going to do this, and then transformed into a process as a $200 million project to build a brand new campus for this over 200-year-old school and to move both of those campuses. So they had this director of technology position open right when they made the decision to move. And the position was to lead all aspects of it while also helping to move the campus on the technology front. Now, I've been a director of technology at Langley, but that meant like I kind of worked with the teachers with computers. I'd never done anything around like managing a phone system, managing a network, things that usually, and I told them this in the interview process. And they're like, you'll be fine. I'm like, what? And I said, yes. I remember being absolutely petrified. Like, I'm so incompetent to do this job, but they believed I'd figure it out. And honestly, I figured it out. The next piece I said yes to with the school is a few years later, I realized nobody had talked about like actually moving the school. I remember walking down the hall, Ham Clark, who is Nobles class of 67, was the first connection to Nobles. He was the head of school there at the time. And I remember walking down to Ham's office saying, is this like, have you like thought of whoever could actually move the campus? Like, we haven't talked at all about like buying furniture. And he's like, you can do that. I was like, what do you mean I can do that? And I said yes. And it ended up being one of the most powerful roles I've had in education. Over the next 3 years, I worked to move the entire campus and the community. I made decisions about what we'd be donating back to the community, what we'd bring with us, what we wouldn't. I outfitted all the classrooms. I worked to bring the culture forward. It's just saying yes to stuff. And in the face of that fear of, I think I'm out of my depth, having the confidence you'll figure it out, and knowing that others have that confidence in you or they wouldn't offer it. Sixth is around work-life balance. And I believe strongly, and I really have come to a place of real kind of Zen clarity, that work-life balance is simply different for everyone. There's just no such thing as a rule. I get asked probably the most common question I've been asked in the last 15 years is, how do you do it? How do you do it? I get asked that several times a week. That's often code for, are you dropping balls at work or are you dropping balls at home? And I feel that. I can often feel that, like, what's really going on here? How do you do it? I imagine people have images of my children like being home and unfed. And I'll be honest, it's actually really ironic because they actually are home and unfed right now because I'm in my office and they haven't had dinner, but like, that grain of salt aside. But I also know my case of being a single parent is part of their script. There's almost impossibility for people to imagine that I can do my job, do this job, which seems impossible on a good day for the best of circumstances. And they're thinking you're a single parent and their father doesn't live nearby, a family nearby, and something has to be breaking, right? Like, there's no way that can possibly be, and you're still standing. I've also learned just how judged and guilty so many working women feel about all of this, all of the time. I mean, it just is so heartbreaking. I'm often in conversations where I can tell my situation intimidates people. People are like, if she can manage this job with 3 kids at home without a partner, and I'm stressed out with my 1 child and a smaller job and I have a partner, what's wrong with me? And that's awful. We simply must work together as women to tear those judgments down. Each person's stress and struggle is real. When somebody's not stressed and struggling, that's real. It's not because one person's weaker or stronger. We've got to lift one another up, not compete for who does it better, and not look for the holes to see where it's not going well. So yeah, my balance does work really well for me, and I'm proud of that. And I've got days that are a disaster. And there's plenty of things I miss. And my son the other day was remembering how back when he was in daycare, and I'd forget that it was alphabet of the day for whatever the week was. I'd be scrounging in the car for like the paper clip he could bring in for letter P day. And I've been in lots of moments that are laughable, but where I've dropped balls, and many where I'm just deeply proud for how I've prioritized my kids and been there for them. And my balance is my balance. And I just hope we can release each other from feeling like there's some bar to meet or some floor you can't go below, because it's hard enough for all of us in trying to navigate it. And it feels like there's this added pressure that we could help each other with in lifting that up. 7th, I've learned that having biracial children does not mean that it's obvious to everyone how central DEI work is to my personal mission and leadership. It also does not absolve my own white privilege. So I've been engaged in DEI work since my early 20s, as Kate mentioned. I first got immersed in this work when I attended the National Association of Independent Schools, NAIS, that's our umbrella group. I went to their Summer Diversity Institute. It's also where I met Randolph Carter. At the time, he ran diversity efforts for NAIS. And I ended up working with him for the next few decades. I was really privileged to do so. It's actually by serving on the faculty of one of his future Summer Diversity Institutes for Randolph, where I met my ex-husband. My ex-husband is Jamaican American, and while he used to be an independent school English teacher, he then became a college professor, and he's now a dean of a college of arts and sciences with a focus on intercultural communications. I actually got connected into him through that. And I'll admit that it's caught me deeply off guard at times, particularly as a head of school, because I think this role is very different, when it hasn't been clear to everybody that, and people haven't necessarily assumed my commitment to DEI work. I feel like I wear it on my sleeve. And yet I realize that when you're leading an organization, when I'm leading a school, it's not enough to assume that people know. I need to say certain things out loud, often multiple times. People need to hear my enduring commitment to this work and not just guess it. I can't take that for granted. And that's really been a lesson that I had to take to heart and then think about what I need to speak to and when. I also recognize my very privileged place as a white person. Well, I undoubtedly have a different lens on this, raising my own children, but I've not walked the same walk myself, and nothing can replace that. And that's something I have to have in my head and my heart as I'm committed to this work, in knowing what my voice means and what it doesn't, what my journey means and what it doesn't, what my own experience means and what it doesn't. And lastly, I've certainly most recently learned that the pandemic has brought a pretty big resurgence of the inequities that we fought so hard to eradicate over recent decades. The hit to the service sector of the pandemic has certainly more disproportionately affected women. The school closures and just the tragedy of what this pandemic has done for inequities in our education sector has also more hard hit women who have been disproportionately in a position of having to leave the workforce or compromise their ability to do their jobs. It's been a big hit. So I'll tell you, anyone who knows me knows I'm a pretty big optimist. I do tend to always seek the light. I try to seek the path ahead. So please take my closing comments with that in mind. Hopefully you don't dismiss it because they're optimistic. But I know I tend to always look for the silver linings in things. And I just believe that the generations of women before us who broke those ceilings, who tromped that ground, who fought a fight that honestly has enabled me to be in this room, to be on this call today. A pandemic can't erase that. Their fight was too hard and it made too great an impact. So how does our generation of women, how do we harness? And by generation, I am putting this all together. Anyone on the screen is in a position right now to make a difference. How do we harness those anchors that were planted before us to help us get back up on our feet and ready for the next chapter in our journey forward? I really look forward to answering questions. And I know that Kate had invited folks to put some things in the Q&A. And Kate, I'm going to see what you think about our next steps here and moving forward.
Fantastic. All right. I am going to show myself view. Hold on. Give me one sec. Awesome. Thank you so much, Cathy. I was like furiously taking notes, as someone who's had my career in education as well. I think one thing that, people would love to know is sort of what advice would you have for women starting out in education, but also, in any sector? If you could go back and talk to those 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds who are just out of college, but particularly in education.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think kind of weaving in some of what I kind of threaded through, the mentorship thing is enormous. And I think when you're young, being willing to ask for it and not being embarrassed to ask for it. I think it's often the first time you do that where you say, will you help me? Like, are you somebody? And figuring out who that right person is, finding somebody that you really do click with. You need to know that people who are in positions of leadership are craving opportunities to invest in young people. And frankly, if they're not, you don't want to work there. That's lesson number 2. When you're interviewing for jobs, I give this advice all the time. Ask those questions. How would you invest in my growth? And actually, those answers should inform whether you want to be there or not. Ask for stories of what are the success stories of people who have been able to move into, and this is assuming you want to move up in positions, but it's also just if you want to get better at your work. If you strive to be a career classroom teacher, I want to disavow success in education doesn't just mean you become a head of school. And I think this notion of you get to be a great classroom teacher, so therefore you should get promoted into, we need great classroom teachers. It's all good. And I hope that you find people, so if that's what you're seeking, find a department chair, find a tenured teacher, find people who can spend time with you and find joy in doing that. Where they'll come in and watch you teach, where they'll give you feedback after a meeting. These are people who will be your truth tellers, but you need to find people who are a match for your personality. Don't go to the person who every time they give you feedback, you're going to fall apart or get defensive, or if their style is not the right fit. So being willing to kind of figure that out, being willing to say yes. And I do think this is a real challenge. I'm not suggesting you get taken advantage of. Don't say yes to a job where I told you I was being paid $16,000. I was being taken advantage of. I was working like 80 hours a week and that was crazy. And I did eventually go in and advocate for a better salary. And I hope you do that. You have every right to be seeking, and women are often so much less so much less comfortable discussing salary and negotiating for that. And so I strongly encourage that you go in confidently to advocate, but being willing to say yes to things through the lens of, will this help me get better at my job? And leaders in schools in any sector are looking for people who just want to add value and are seeking to contribute to build the place up, and sending that message out of the gates. I'm in it for the organization. I'm in it for the mission. I'm not in it for the transaction. If they feel like you're going to take that thing and leave in 6 months, they'll be a lot less eager to help invest in your growth than it's, I just want opportunities to keep being here, and sending that message over and over again.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we have a few questions in the Q&A, but if other people have things, feel free to pop it in. One question is about what Nobles as an institution can do to support and promote women and people of color who would be in leadership positions in schools.
Gosh, there's so much. Well, number one, just through modeling, right? This is back to sort of where I feel a real responsibility. I participate in a lot of stuff. I say yes to every panel I possibly can. I mean, and I'm doing a lot of that. And I think that's incredibly important, and not just around issues around gender and DEI issues. I think there is just having Nobles female leader be a national leader is a really important place for us to be, and in modeling what that can and should look like. And so I think we have an obligation to certainly continue to do that, to be investing in our own young female leaders as they are emerging. And we've been scaffolding a lot of programs to do that. I think there's a lot that we can do as we move along, but I have been working over the last year on all kinds of notions for leadership development programs that we can formalize here for our women, for our employees of color, for, one of the challenges we have at Nobles is it's a good problem, but like no one leaves. Right. We have this like Hotel California quality, like everyone comes and they like stay put. And right. It's one of the secret sauce pieces. Like, I don't want that to change. That's awesome. The other piece that we have, which is very unusual, is that our leadership is almost entirely from within. And I have to say, this still is a startling statistic for me. So of an administrative team of 17 people, 2 of them were hired for their jobs. I don't know that you'll find a school anywhere that has, and that's a great sign of we've invested in people and we've cultivated them and brought them through. It makes it very difficult to diversify your leadership base when you have very little turnover. And when you do, it's kind of a given, you're kind of pushing from within. And so trying to find this balance of, number one, ensuring really talented young people see a career path here and don't look at it and say, well, no one's ever leaving. And, I have to be here 30 years to be a department chair. Trying to find some really important ways for us to shake that up without undermining the foundation of some looking at our department chair structure to say, can we find healthy ways for us to innovate that and diversify? Where we can bring some fresh perspective in from the outside, let's do it. Realizing we are a place where we tend to be a little resistant to outsiders. And I can answer a question about that if you'd like, it can be challenging. So certainly finding ways to create those structures and those programs. And then I really hope we're graduating students that are themselves looking to make, obviously, our mission of leadership for the public good. What can we be doing to ensure they have the interest and the skill set to be able to thrive in that space?
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you. I know that joke about we never leave and then some of us just come back. But so many of my teachers when I was a student at Nobles are still there, which is so friendly, but I can understand some of the things you're talking about that it affects that. We have another question about sort of the day-to-day leading a school like Nobles. What are some of the challenges as a leader of the school? I think this is beyond just as a woman, but just sort of as a leader of the school. If you can talk about some of those challenges, and I'm going to actually layer onto that, like this past year has been obviously an incredibly unusual year. So, some of the more recent challenges as well.
I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. I take a lot of naps. I just woke up before that. Yeah, no, it's challenging. And the job of head of school really over the last 20 years has demands on the job and the lack of shift of expectation from the different audiences, that kind of whatever the vortex has really been challenging. So you go back, maybe more than 20 years ago, this notion of being a headmaster, really the role had always been traditionally being a principal. I talk to Nobles grads all the time who will talk about Elliot Putnam and how his role as the football coach, and he's out there and he knew every kid. And you look at the size of our school back then, you look at what the world looked like back then, you look at what specialization looked back. The head of school or the headmaster was the principal. It was the dean of students. It was the admissions person, where we all know about Elliot knocking on doors to enroll students. And now I'm running, what is a $50 million a year business, where there are expectations to simultaneously, though, still be that principal and still be that person that knows every student and opens car doors and knows every parent and is in classrooms and is the best teacher in the school. But by the way, you need to be strategically leading a very complex organization, one of the country's best schools in a very competitive, complex area with legal issues and HR issues and fundraising demands that didn't used to exist. And everyone's expectations, they kind of get that. And yet you kind of need to be all things to all people. And I think most heads would say finding that balance of how you spend your time and wanting to be thriving in all domains is really challenging. And finding what your version of that is, because actually all of those matter to me a lot. That's why I love the job. I love the meeting I had earlier today with my advisee, followed by a really difficult strategic discussion about admissions, followed by a hard meeting with a parent, followed by walking into a classroom. And my days have that mixture of really high level and very low level. Now you layer onto it multiple global crises. So already you felt like, okay, I've kind of sort of got this and we're at capacity. Oh, by the way, pandemic, racial justice crisis, global warming crisis, financial crisis. No question this last year has been, somewhat surreal, where I feel so unbelievably just privileged is to be leading Nobles and to not be in any other school. And I do talk to school leaders all the time. I've got groups I speak to weekly, and just having, back to the faculty that don't leave, having a faculty that is just extraordinary and is simply there. They're just simply there. They're there for their students. They're there for one another. It isn't what do we do, it's how do we do it. And when I hear about petitions from other school faculties and I hear about how all of that went, we had a group that said, this is really hard, but what can we do? We approached issues of DEI last summer from a how do we listen, what can we learn, what can we do about it? And so we've had a very different lens on this, but I'll also would be dishonest not to say this has been really hard. Our constituencies right now are in extremely different places and they're all acutely there. So, and so as I'm steering a ship, I have my parent group, and within the parent body, there's widely divergent needs. For some, their kids are really hurting and they're very scared for their kids and they're desperate for us to fix it. There's some who are just scared of the pandemic and desperate for us to keep their kids safe while they're here. We have faculty and staff who are feeling that they are here for it at all costs for their kids, but also know that they're potentially putting their own safety at risk and trusting in the school to keep them safe. We have students who are feeling isolated and hurting. And so goodness, making decisions, knowing there is no one decision that can possibly meet everybody where they are in the ways that you wish you could. And knowing you're just going to inevitably have some disappointment, and knowing that as we're a year into this, the frustration is off the charts, but keeping our pace. So the way I approached this year is last year in the summer, amidst all of this turmoil, I had a centeredness around, we have to have principles that guide us. We simply have to, or we're going to be a ping pong ball of trying to meet each person and being reactive. And I knew that was not what we could do to keep the ship stable and to make sure we keep our eye on those priorities. And so our three principles all year, and I beat this drum over and over again, number one is health and safety, and we simply will not compromise on keeping our community safe. Number two has been equity of access, and I will not reopen our school in a way that disadvantages some over the other. We're going to make sure everyone has access to what we're offering. And then number three is meeting each person where they are. And so what that meant for us is we didn't force anybody to come back. We said to our faculty and staff, I believe it will be safe. We'll be doing everything we can, but we're going to meet you where you are. And if you have health or safety concerns, we'll figure it out. And if you need to be remote, we'll figure that out. But let's wait until we see where we're going. We said the same to our families. And so we have had some faculty and staff who've needed to be virtual this year. We've had some kids who've needed to be, and we've made it work. And at each juncture, as we've looked at the next sports season, the next iteration of what we can add, that's been our question. I will admit, I am ecstatic to have finally access to a vaccine. I'll be holding a faculty meeting tomorrow morning, so I can't give you more than my faculty will hear tomorrow, but I can tell you what I told them last night, which is that we are going to be offering our faculty and staff a vaccine at the end of next week. And it's going to be a part of a pretty large and pretty exciting public-private partnership that we've been able to create to make a difference for public and private school educators locally. So I'll be letting our faculty and staff know that, and I'll be happy to share it after I send the parents a letter later this weekend. But finally being able to do something proactive. It's been a year where I think we've all felt like we're in reactive mode and protective mode and buffering mode. And it feels like there truly is a light at the end of this tunnel. We're not going to be normal the way we were pre-pandemic tomorrow, but we certainly are going to get to a place where we can do some of the more normal things that feed our soul and fill that well back up and allow us to focus on some other things other than just surviving, to the next day as we go along. And so I'll end by saying, leading Nobles on the day-to-day and in the macro, we are all about the people. They're like our, businesses have stocks. We have kids and people. The people are what we are. We're relationships, and our mantra of relationship before task has just never been more important. And so amidst these crises, we come back to our people and come back to our community. And that's where we're going to emerge from this. Yeah, a little battered, but goodness, knowing that Nobles stood by our people. And that's what I want. People to look back in 5 years and say, that was really rough, but Nobles stood by me.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have a couple more questions. And I'm trying to figure out which order to go in because you touched on a couple of these things in your comments. But one of them is about who are the other female leaders within Nobles who you do lean on. I think we have a varying degree of guests tonight who know the current faculty, but it would be great to just hear, who are people within the school who are part of your everyday.
See, this is an unfair question because if I leave somebody out, I'm going to feel so guilty. So any of the Nobles faculty on this, please, like, don't judge me. It'd be like, how did she not mention Shannon Clark? So I'll start with Shannon Clark, who's an amazing academic leader. But on the senior leadership team, we just do have extraordinary women, and many of whom have been here for so long. Maura Sullivan, who's our Dean of Faculty, extraordinaire. And Dean of Faculty is this like obtuse role that at Nobles, what it means is she's a right-hand person for, I mean, during this pandemic, and she's part of a group I meet with 3 times a week. She's done everything from completely overhauling our academic schedule to she oversees faculty evaluation, to her wisdom on how to help our community thrive, to problem solving the vaccine distribution. So she's certainly one that I count on as a very close colleague and friend. Kate Ramsdale, who now is director of our college office. She'd been Kate Boyle, for those of you who are here from before. She's college office and. I asked Kate a few years ago to take over what is a huge priority of mine around student wellness and our partnership with Stanford's Challenge Success. And I thought it was so important. Number one, Kate's just unbelievable and can lead anything. But actually the idea of situating wellness within what you might think is the most pressure cooked part of our program around college counseling. But I believe so strongly that smart rigor and student wellness can and should go hand in hand. And Kate has been such an important thought partner in bringing, and this will be a big part of our next long range plan, of bringing the tentacles of student support together. So we're not dealing with counseling over here and academic rigor over there. It's very much a hand in hand of helping kids thrive. Jennifer Hines, who leads our admissions office and has been Dean of Enrollment. She's been here now for over a few decades, and she certainly has been critical to our efforts to diversify our student body, to think about what is now, we were up 25% in enrollment. And so with an acceptance rate that's hovering around 15% and trying to be increased, and yet all of our goals around diversity and access and the pressures on financial aid. She's been a thought leader. These all come back to intersecting to who our community is and how we're being defined. To our communications director, Heather Sullivan, and her amazing leadership team with Kim Neal and Ann Hurlbut, and those who are making a huge difference in how we're messaging who we are. Because of course there's the who we are and how we ensure all of you know what that is and feel confident in all of that. I obviously would kind of end, and I'm trying to make sure I'm missing anybody else before I get to, of course, with Kate and her leadership. I mean, this is what we need at our school, this event and the vision for us to be able to say, how do we help reach out to a greater part of our graduate body and create these moments and opportunities for engagement. The silver lining of this pandemic, if I had to highlight, like if I had to rank order, I'd say number 1 is community engagement. The fact that we can do this, and I'm sure many of you are around the country right now, and what was, granted, we're eager to get back on campus, but we have parent events now. I do town halls every other week, and we're getting 300 parents joining. And if we were doing in-person events before this, we'd struggle to sometimes get the double digits on some things. And we have found ways to engage a community more broadly in really exciting ways that I hope that we stick with.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's been, I don't, we want to talk about silver linings, and I don't want to harp on it too much because I think for my constituents who are all around the country, I have an easier job of that. But it has been so wonderful being able to include so many graduates from around the country and even, and around the world. We have a couple more questions, and then we do want to make sure we end on time. This is an interesting question about gender roles and stereotypes informing sort of at a young age. This is from a working mom of 2 young boys. And I also am a mom of 2 young boys, a working mom of 2 young boys. And this grad is asking about instilling gender equity values in your sons and in the young men at Nobles.
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, I think about it a great deal with having both my sons and my daughter, and I'd say it comes at me very differently at different times. I certainly believe them seeing their mom in this role is incredibly important. And there's moments it's tough. Their kids know how to push your buttons. They know just what to say to make you feel guilty. And my boys are 14 and 12. My daughter is almost 10. And I'll get home tonight. And of course I got them home from school and I got them all settled, and I'll still get the kind of guilty, you had a work piece, or in the mornings, I have an early morning thing and I'm asking to help get out the door. And I try to find these moments to talk about the privilege of what their mom does and the impact I get to make, and try to have those moments because they often do see different models, and both being a single parent and a single mom, and it is outlier in many ways, and in helping them recognize the outlier, the fact that what they see as normal is not are not the norm set. So I certainly try to find the teachable moments at every step of the way that I can to interrupt when I hear them say something that might just come out of their mouth because it's what they've kind of seen on TV or heard from friends. At Nobles in particular, we've been talking a great deal about this, and we have some student clubs whose focus is entirely around this, around gender equity and being able to send messages. They've been doing some amazing work in our assembly talks. We have some student affinity groups that we've engaged both at the middle school level and in the upper school level, where our students are talking around a lot of gender identity. And that's been expanding very rapidly as students who have gender identities across the spectrum just want to come and be in conversation around it. There's a lot of energy for our kids to join that, but a lot of their focus is how do we help the students who aren't in this club meeting gain an understanding. And so we're weaving that through we have our personal development courses that we've been really overhauling and trying to make sure all students have this. It needs, and we're spending a lot of time doing this deep dive on our curriculum and our programming. We're in the middle of a climate assessment, and a climate assessment is intended to really do that audit across the board around diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice. And one core aspect, of course, is what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. And I anticipate that there will be a whole bunch that comes out of that informs a lot of that work. But how do we interrogate our history curriculum, our English curriculum, with this question in mind around all forms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that we start to think about not just pulling books off a shelf and throwing them back in. Yes, it's the what we're teaching, but it's also the how we're teaching it. And when we're thinking about teaching the right book that might get to these questions around gender equity issues, how are we teaching it? And are we trained to teach that right and well? And so we're trying to layer all of that in as we think about the work that we're doing and how we're going to be doing it.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm going to end with a question. And this has been such an exciting event for me because, again, as I said in my intro, I think, we often hear you share about updates about Nobles and the strategic plan and the students and the current happenings, but it's been so great, getting to know you and a little bit about your story. So this grad is asking, how much of your story do the students know of these stories that you've shared with us tonight, these lessons? Is there an opportunity for you to share those with our students?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I try to. I got to be careful. When I speak to students, I'm talking to a range of 12 through 19. And by the way, my son is now sitting in the audience. I have my oldest is in 8th grade, so I can no longer tell stories about him. And I do have to be cautious about that. I am very conscious of him having his own journey in space through here and my other 2 kids if they end up coming through. But I do try to weave stories that I typically speak in assembly once a week. And I will frequently, and Kate knows this, tell stories. My daughter tends to be the center of my stories because she does stuff that's just, it is kind of nutty, but it allows me to, through those stories, which often have some humor in them. My most recent one was where she decided to put black nail polish in the bathtub and then dip her hands in it, which if I wouldn't try this at home, because what it does is the black nail polish seeps into your skin and you'll spend 4 hours with nail polish remover. And by the way, it seeps into the bathtub too. Sort of reminded me of, anyway, it doesn't matter. So, but through those stories, being able to shed some light on my life and with my kids. I told a story maybe a few months ago about my knee injury and what that meant for what happened with me having to pivot and study abroad. And often we'll try to have some lesson of kind of look for that. But I need to do 4-minute chunks of those and also recognizing the right ways to be vulnerable with young kids and the times they just really need to know their head of school has it together. And they don't really need to hear some things that I think would leave people going, uh-oh, she's running the school. But I've told stories about some of my challenges when I was young. And I think those vulnerabilities can be incredibly important. And, we are a school that is so extraordinary in every way, right? Success here is off the charts. And one of the things I worry the most about is our kids knowing it's safe to fail while they're here. And if they don't hear and see models of actually, I totally screwed that up and it was still okay. If we don't tell stories of struggle and survival, if we don't have humility and humor embedded in that, if all they're seeing up on stage is what they deem to be perfection they can't meet, that's not the model. That's not the lesson. That's actually not what excellence is. Excellence is being able to try, fail, and get up again and do it again. And so I certainly look for those moments and those opportunities. And I certainly will continue to strive to do that. So thank you, Kate.
Well, Cathy, I can't thank you enough. This has been such a fun hour to spend with you. And I think we can all relate to at least one thing that you've said, if not, all 8 lessons plus your answers. For anyone, one last thing that I just wanted to share with everyone is that I am going to put into the chat the group to join Women of Nobles. Again, as I said in the opening, we really are hoping to have this be a yearly event, of course, leading up to 2025, which is around the corner, which is 50 years of Nobles going co-ed. But thank you so much, Cathy, for taking the time out of your busy schedule. We really appreciate it.
And thank you, Kate. Thanks to all of you for joining amidst your busy schedule. Look forward to seeing you in person soon. That's our goal for 2021.
Yes, please. Fantastic. Well, have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.